The story begins far from power, in the dusty interior of northeastern Brazil, where drought and hunger shaped daily life more than ambition ever could. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was born in 1945 into a family so poor that survival itself was an achievement. The land offered little mercy, and work was irregular, exhausting, and barely enough to keep hunger at bay. His father left early, and his mother carried the full weight of raising her children in conditions that stripped childhood of its softness. Shoes were a luxury, school was uncertain, and food was never guaranteed. Like countless Brazilian children pushed prematurely into adulthood, Lula learned early that dignity often came from work, even when that work was humiliating or invisible. He sold peanuts, ran errands, and shined shoes in the streets, absorbing the rhythms of inequality long before he understood the language to describe it. Each coin earned was less about aspiration and more about keeping the family alive for another day. Migration became an act of desperation rather than choice. Lula's mother made the painful decision to move the family to São Paulo, Brazil's industrial heart, chasing rumors of factory jobs and opportunity. The journey itself reflected the brutal divide between Brazil's forgotten interior and its booming cities. In São Paulo, opportunity existed, but it was unevenly distributed and fiercely guarded. The family settled on the margins, where overcrowded housing and unstable work defined life for millions of migrants. Lula entered school late and left early, not because he lacked curiosity, but because hunger and responsibility demanded more immediate attention. Formal education slipped away, replaced by factory floors, grease-stained hands, and the constant noise of machines. By his teens, he was working in metal factories, exposed to dangerous conditions that injured his hand and permanently marked his body. The loss of a finger was not just a physical injury. It symbolized the cost paid by workers whose bodies were treated as expendable inputs in Brazil's rapid industrial growth. Factory life revealed a hidden structure beneath Brazil's economic miracle. While the country celebrated growth, workers endured long hours, low wages, and little protection. Lula observed quietly at first, learning how fear operated as a management tool and how solidarity could disappear when survival was at stake. The death of his first wife during childbirth intensified his awareness of how fragile life was for the poor, how easily loss compounded loss. Grief did not radicalize him overnight, but it deepened his understanding that poverty was not an individual failure. It was a system that punished people repeatedly for circumstances they did not choose. In union halls and break rooms, workers whispered about injustice, careful not to attract attention in a country ruled by a military dictatorship intolerant of dissent. Lula listened more than he spoke, slowly developing a language rooted not in ideology but in lived experience. As Brazil's authoritarian regime tightened control, labor unrest simmered beneath the surface. Lula rose through union ranks not because he fit a traditional leader's profile, but because he spoke plainly, without pretense. He did not lecture workers, he sounded like them. His speeches reflected the exhaustion, anger, and quiet pride of people who built the country with their hands, but rarely benefited from its success. Strikes in the late 1970s transformed him from a factory worker into a national figure. These were not romantic uprisings, they were risky, uncertain confrontations with a state willing to imprison leaders and crush movements. Lula was arrested, threatened, and publicly attacked. Yet his popularity grew because he embodied something rare in Brazilian politics: credibility earned through shared hardship. He did not promise miracles, he promised representation. The transition from union leader to political figure was neither smooth nor inevitable. Brazil was emerging slowly from dictatorship, and democracy arrived fragile and incomplete. Lula helped found a political movement rooted in labor, community organizations, and grassroots activism, challenging elite dominance that had defined Brazilian governance for generations. Early electoral defeats tested both his resilience and the patience of his supporters. He lost presidential races, was ridiculed by political opponents, and dismissed by economic elites as unqualified, unpolished, and dangerous. Yet these losses strengthened his connection with ordinary Brazilians, who saw in him their own struggles mirrored back by the political system. Each defeat reinforced the idea that power was reluctant to open its doors to someone who had once shined shoes and lacked formal credentials. By the time Lula finally won the presidency in 2002, his victory was less a sudden breakthrough than the accumulation of decades of collective endurance. It symbolized a rupture in Brazil's political tradition, proving that leadership could emerge from factory floors rather than aristocratic lineages. The boy who once worked the streets had not erased his past to reach power. He carried it with him, shaping his priorities and worldview. His election did not resolve Brazil's contradictions, but it reframed what was possible. The distance between poverty and power remained vast, yet it was no longer unbridgeable. The transformation from shoeshine boy to president was not a fairy tale. It was a testament to persistence within a deeply unequal society, setting the stage for decisions that would soon affect millions who recognized their own lives in his story. Power did not arrive gently, nor did it erase the contradictions that had defined Lula's life. When he assumed the presidency, Brazil stood at a crossroads, balancing fragile democratic institutions, massive inequality, and the expectations of those who had waited generations to be seen. Financial markets watched nervously. Elites warned of collapse, and skeptics predicted chaos under a former factory worker with limited formal education. Lula understood these fears intimately, not as abstract concerns, but as pressures that could destabilize a nation still healing from authoritarian rule. His challenge was not merely to govern, but to prove that someone born into extreme poverty could manage a modern state without betraying either economic stability or the people who had carried him into office. The transition demanded restraint, patience, and an acute awareness that symbolism alone would not feed families or calm investors. Lula chose continuity where rupture might have provoked disaster. He maintained macroeconomic discipline, respected institutional boundaries, and reassured international partners that Brazil would honor its obligations. This pragmatic approach disappointed some allies who expected immediate transformation, yet it reflected a deeper understanding of power shaped by years of negotiation between workers and factory owners. He knew progress rarely came through force alone. It required credibility, timing, and compromise. At the same time, he refused to abandon the moral core of his political identity. The memory of hunger, overcrowded housing, and informal labor was not distant nostalgia. It was the lens through which he evaluated policy. His administration prioritized inclusion not as charity, but as an investment in national stability, recognizing that democracy could not survive while millions remained trapped in survival mode. Social programs became the most visible expression of this philosophy. Initiatives designed to combat extreme poverty targeted families long excluded from state support, particularly in rural regions and urban peripheries. These policies did not emerge from abstract theories, but from lived knowledge of how small, consistent assistance could alter life trajectories. Ensuring children attended school, had access to basic health care, and experienced food security was not framed as generosity, but as restoring a social contract that had never functioned for the poor. The impact was gradual yet profound, lifting millions above the poverty line and reshaping daily life in communities accustomed to neglect. Critics argued over cost and dependency, but evidence showed improved education outcomes, reduced hunger, and greater economic participation, challenging the assumption that inequality was an inevitable feature of Brazilian society. Lula's presidency unfolded during a favorable global economic cycle, yet growth alone did not explain the changes underway. His government expanded access to credit, strengthened domestic markets, and elevated consumption among lower-income Brazilians who had never been considered economic actors. For the first time, domestic workers, factory laborers, and informal vendors felt the state acknowledge their existence beyond policing or taxation. This recognition carried symbolic power equal to material gains. Seeing someone who spoke their language, shared their accent, and understood their fears occupy the highest office altered perceptions of belonging. Politics, long dominated by technocrats and elites, suddenly felt accessible, even if imperfect. The psychological barrier separating the poor from governance began to crack, yet progress did not arrive without tension. Lula navigated a fragmented political system requiring alliances that often conflicted with his movement's ideals. Corruption scandals emerged, implicating figures close to his administration and threatening to undermine the trust that defined his leadership. Lula denied personal wrongdoing, but the damage to public confidence was undeniable. For many supporters, the revelations were devastating, colliding painfully with the hope that this presidency would break decisively from Brazil's history of compromised governance. For opponents, the scandals confirmed long-held suspicions. Lula responded by emphasizing institutional processes, distancing himself from accused allies, and reaffirming his commitment to democratic norms. The crisis tested whether his leadership was rooted in personality or principles, and whether the movement he helped build could survive moral scrutiny. Internationally, Lula redefined Brazil's posture. He sought greater autonomy, strengthening ties with the global South while maintaining dialogue with traditional powers. His diplomacy emphasized cooperation, regional integration, and the idea that developing nations deserved a stronger voice in global decision-making. This approach resonated with countries facing similar inequalities, positioning Brazil as a bridge between worlds rather than a subordinate actor. At home, pride grew as Brazil asserted itself on the world stage, not through military force or ideological alignment, but through negotiation and social inclusion. Lula's background reinforced this worldview. Having experienced marginalization personally, he understood the dynamics of exclusion between nations as well as individuals. As his first term drew to a close, the transformation was incomplete but undeniable. Poverty had declined, inequality had narrowed, and democracy felt more tangible to millions previously excluded from its promises. Lula's journey from Xuxin boy to president had evolved into something larger than personal success. It had become a test case for whether structural inequality could be confronted through democratic means, without destabilizing the state. The answer remained uncertain, shadowed by political compromise and ethical controversy, yet the question itself marked progress. Brazil had begun to imagine itself differently, and Lula's leadership, shaped by hardship rather than privilege, stood at the center of that reimagining, carrying forward the unresolved tension between hope and realism that would define the next chapter of his story. The second term of Lula's presidency unfolded with greater confidence, shaped by the knowledge that survival in power was no longer the primary challenge. Approval ratings rose as economic growth continued and social programs expanded, embedding themselves into the fabric of daily life. Families once invisible to policymakers now structured their futures around stability they had never known, sending children to school with the expectation, not the hope, that education could lead somewhere beyond subsistence. Lula's leadership style remained informal, often criticized by elites but deeply resonant with ordinary citizens who saw authenticity where others saw roughness. His speeches emphasized dignity, not charity, framing social inclusion as a national strength rather than a moral obligation. Brazil's image shifted internally and abroad, increasingly associated with confidence, optimism, and possibility. This period coincided with the sense that Brazil had finally found its footing as a middle power. Infrastructure projects expanded, regional influence grew, and the idea of Brazil as a country perpetually catching up gave way to cautious belief in sustained progress. Lula's government invested in energy, agriculture, and industrial capacity, while maintaining a social agenda that resisted austerity-driven rollback. Critics continued to warn of fiscal irresponsibility, yet poverty reduction statistics and rising employment countered dire predictions. The contradiction at the heart of Lula's presidency persisted: a man shaped by deprivation governing a system built on compromise with entrenched interests. Rather than dismantle that system, he attempted to bend it toward inclusion, accepting imperfections as the price of movement forward. Yet the deeper Lula embedded himself in Brazil's political machinery, the more exposed he became to its corrosion. Allegations of corruption refused to disappear, resurfacing in new forms and implicating networks of power that transcended any single administration. Even as Lula maintained personal popularity, public trust in institutions wavered. Supporters argued that corruption was structural, inherited, and exaggerated by opponents unwilling to accept a working-class president. Detractors insisted that moral authority had been squandered. Lula himself responded not with denial of systemic flaws, but with insistence that progress should not be dismissed because of imperfection. The tension between ethical aspiration and political reality hardened into a defining feature of his legacy. As his presidency neared its constitutional end, Lula faced a paradox few leaders experience. He left office widely admired, yet surrounded by unresolved controversies that would outlive his tenure. The peaceful transfer of power to his chosen successor reinforced democratic continuity, a rarity in Brazil's history. It also marked the moment when Lula transitioned from governing force to historical figure, his achievements no longer shielded by the immediacy of office. The social policies he championed had altered expectations permanently. Withdrawing them became politically unthinkable. In that sense, Lula succeeded not only in policy, but in reshaping the boundaries of acceptable governance. Poverty reduction was no longer optional. Inclusion had become a benchmark. Outside government, Lula's presence remained influential. He traveled, spoke internationally, and continued to embody Brazil's rise in global forums. For many abroad, he represented a model of leadership emerging from the global South, pragmatic, socially conscious, and rooted in democratic legitimacy. At home, however, political polarization intensified. Economic shifts, leadership changes, and renewed investigations began to reframe his story through darker lenses. The same background that once symbolized hope was now weaponized by critics who portrayed him as unfit or corrupt. The narrative began to fracture, reflecting broader anxieties about accountability, justice, and power in a country still struggling to reconcile progress with integrity. Investigations into corruption expanded, sweeping across parties and industries, implicating business leaders and politicians at every level. Lula's name increasingly surfaced, not as an abstract symbol, but as a legal subject. Supporters viewed the scrutiny as selective and politically motivated, arguing that Lula represented a threat to entrenched elites seeking to reverse social gains. Opponents framed the investigations as long overdue accountability, proof that no one should stand above the law. Lula denied wrongdoing, asserting that his prosecution reflected deeper struggles over Brazil's political direction rather than individual guilt. The courtroom replaced the campaign trail as the arena where his legacy would be contested. The transition from celebrated former president to defendant altered public perception profoundly. Images of Lula once associated with factories, crowds, and international summits were replaced by legal documents, headlines, and uncertainty. For millions who had experienced tangible improvement during his presidency, the accusations felt personal, as though their own progress were under indictment. For others, it was confirmation that systemic change had never truly occurred. The man who had embodied upward mobility now stood at the center of Brazil's institutional crisis, symbolizing both its democratic aspirations and its unresolved contradictions. Yet even as legal challenges mounted, Lula's story resisted closure. His life had never followed a straight line, and the idea that it would end neatly contradicted everything it represented. The boy who shined shoes had learned early that survival required endurance through humiliation and loss. Power had not erased vulnerability. It had simply changed its form. As Brazil wrestled with its future, Lula's journey remained unfinished, suspended between achievement and judgment. The next chapter would test whether his rise had been an exception shaped by circumstance, or a transformation durable enough to survive reversal, controversy, and the weight of history itself. The legal battles that followed Lula's presidency unfolded against a backdrop of national unease, as Brazil confronted the limits of its institutions and the fragility of its democratic trust. Court rulings, appeals, and televised proceedings turned justice into a public spectacle, blurring the line between accountability and political theater. Lula's conviction and imprisonment shocked supporters who viewed it as the culmination of a campaign to erase the social gains associated with his leadership. For them, the image of a former president behind bars echoed older patterns in Brazilian history, where popular figures were removed through legal or institutional means when electoral defeat proved insufficient. For critics, the imprisonment symbolized the rule of law finally reaching the powerful. The country split not only over Lula's guilt or innocence, but over the meaning of justice itself in a system long accused of selective enforcement. Prison stripped Lula of the authority and protection once afforded by office, reducing him to an individual confronting the state. Yet even confined, he remained politically present. Statements smuggled through lawyers, messages read aloud by allies, and the persistent loyalty of supporters outside prison walls reinforced his symbolic power. The narrative of a man who had risen from poverty now facing incarceration, resonated deeply among those who believed inequality shaped not only opportunity, punishment. Lula framed his imprisonment as part of a larger struggle, insisting that ideas could not be jailed even if bodies could. His resilience drew strength from the same sources that had sustained him as a child: endurance, collective identity, and faith in eventual recognition. As years passed, judicial decisions began to unravel earlier rulings. Questions emerged about jurisdiction, due process, and the impartiality of those who had prosecuted the case. Courts overturned convictions, restoring Lula's political rights and reigniting debates that had never fully settled. To supporters, the reversals validated long-held claims that justice had been compromised. To opponents, they represented technicalities rather than exoneration. Yet the practical effect was undeniable. Lula returned to the political arena, legally eligible, his story further complicated by the experience of imprisonment. He emerged neither unbroken nor vindicated in the eyes of all, but undeniably transformed, carrying scars that deepened his understanding of power's volatility. The Brazil Lula re-entered was not the country he had left. Economic stagnation, rising inequality, and deep polarization had reshaped public life. The optimism of earlier years had given way to anger, mistrust, and fatigue. Institutions once celebrated as guardians of democracy now faced skepticism, accused of overreach or failure. Lula's return forced Brazilians to confront unresolved questions about leadership, accountability, and memory. Could a figure so central to the nation's past also represent its future, or had time, controversy, and generational change rendered him a symbol of an era that could not be reclaimed? Lula approached this moment with a tone tempered by experience. His rhetoric emphasized reconciliation over triumph, stability over confrontation. He acknowledged mistakes without surrendering his narrative, insisting that progress achieved under his leadership remained real and measurable. His message targeted those most affected by economic decline, reminding them of a time when the state had actively sought to include rather than abandon them. For younger voters, Lula represented history. For older supporters, he embodied proof that improvement was possible. The campaign atmosphere was charged not with novelty but with memory. Contested, emotional, and powerful. The election that followed was less a choice between individuals than between interpretations of Brazil's recent past. Lula's victory signaled not unanimous approval, but a collective decision shaped by comparison and consequence. His return to office carried none of the innocence of his first ascent. Instead, it arrived weighted with expectation, scrutiny, and the knowledge that redemption narratives rarely satisfy everyone. For many, his election symbolized resistance to regression and a reformation of democratic process. For others, it felt like repetition, a failure to break free from familiar cycles. Lula himself framed it as responsibility rather than triumph, aware that governing after controversy required legitimacy built through action, not memory. In office again, Lula confronted constraints sharper than before. Global conditions were less forgiving, domestic institutions more fractured, and patience thinner. His policies emphasized rebuilding social safety nets, restoring international credibility, and calming political tensions. The boy who once shined shoes now governed a country exhausted by conflict, expected to heal divisions he had not solely created. His leadership drew upon lessons learned not only in factories and union halls, but in courtrooms and prison cells, spaces that had exposed the extremes of power and vulnerability. Lula's life now spanned extremes rarely contained within a single narrative: poverty and presidency, adoration and imprisonment, hope and controversy. His return did not resolve debates about his legacy, it intensified them. Yet the arc of his journey challenged simplistic conclusions. It forced Brazil to grapple with whether progress could survive imperfection, whether democracy could absorb conflict without collapse, and whether leadership rooted in lived hardship retained relevance in a changing world. The answer remained unfinished, unfolding in policy decisions, public reactions, and the quiet recalibration of expectations. Lula's story, once defined by ascent, now centered on endurance, an ongoing test of whether transformation once achieved could be defended against reversal, doubt, and the relentless passage of time. The final chapter of Lula da Silva's story does not offer a clean resolution, because lives shaped by inequality rarely do. Instead, it presents a long arc of consequence, one that stretches beyond a single individual and into the moral memory of a nation. From the streets where he once shined shoes to the presidential palace he entered more than once, Lula's life exposed Brazil to itself. It forced the country to confront truths it had long avoided: that poverty was not destiny, that leadership did not require elite origins, and that democracy gained strength when those excluded from it finally claimed space within it. His journey did not erase Brazil's inequalities, but it made them visible and therefore harder to ignore. What distinguishes Lula's rise is not merely that he escaped poverty, but that he refused to treat his escape as an ending. Many leave hardship behind by distancing themselves from it, reshaping their identities to fit power. Lula carried his past forward, allowing it to inform his decisions and priorities. Hunger shaped his understanding of policy more than theory ever could. The insecurity of informal work taught him the value of stability. The humiliation of being unseen gave him sensitivity to dignity as a political principle. These experiences translated into governance that viewed social investment not as charity, but as infrastructure for democracy itself. The lesson embedded here is uncomfortable yet profound: systems change most meaningfully when led by those who have endured their failures. At the same time, Lula's life resists idealization. His story demonstrates that moral clarity does not guarantee moral immunity. Power entangles, compromises accumulate, and institutions shape behavior as much as individuals do. His involvement in a political system marked by corruption revealed the limits of personal integrity within flawed structures. This does not negate his achievements, but it complicates them, reminding us that progress often arrives alongside contradiction. The lesson is not that leaders must be perfect to matter, but that societies must build systems strong enough to restrain even those they admire. Democracy depends not on flawless figures, but on accountability that applies universally. Lula's imprisonment and eventual return underscored another enduring truth: justice and politics are rarely separate in unequal societies. His supporters saw in his prosecution a warning about how institutions can be used to shape political outcomes. His critics saw affirmation that no one stands above the law. Both perspectives reflect deeper anxieties about fairness in a country where punishment has historically fallen harder on the poor than the powerful. Lula's experience became a mirror, forcing Brazilians to question not only one man's guilt or innocence, but the consistency of their justice system. The lesson here is sobering: when trust in institutions erodes, every verdict becomes suspect, and democracy itself begins to fray. Perhaps the most enduring impact of Lula's life lies in how it altered expectations. Before him, leadership seemed reserved for those born into advantage, educated in exclusivity, and fluent in elite codes. After him, millions understood that their voices mattered, that their experiences counted as political knowledge. This shift cannot be easily reversed. Even critics who reject Lula's legacy must contend with a political landscape forever changed by his presence. The poor, once treated as passive recipients of policy, became active participants in defining national priorities. The lesson is subtle but powerful: representation is not symbolic. It reshapes what societies believe is possible. Lula's story also reveals the cost of endurance. Rising from poverty demanded resilience. Surviving power required adaptability. Returning after disgrace required humility. Each phase extracted a price, visible in the fatigue of later years and the tempered tone of his leadership. Success did not insulate him from suffering. It redistributed it across different forms. This challenges simplistic narratives of triumph, replacing them with a more honest understanding of progress as something fragile, reversible, and constantly contested. The lesson is not that struggle ends with success, but that its shape changes, demanding new forms of strength. In the end, the image of a boy shining shoes is not powerful because it contrasts dramatically with the presidency, because it reminds us where political vision can originate. Lula's life suggests that history does not move only through great ideas or elite institutions, but through accumulated human experiences of need, solidarity, and resilience. His legacy will continue to be debated, revised, and contested, but the core truth remains intact: a society that allows its poorest citizens to imagine themselves as leaders expands the boundaries of democracy itself. The final lesson of Lula da Silva's story is neither inspirational nor cynical. It is human. Beginnings do not define endings, but they shape the values carried along the way. Power can amplify purpose, but it can also distort it. Progress is possible, but never permanent. And dignity, once claimed, becomes difficult to suppress. From the streets to the state, from hunger to governance, Lula's life stands as evidence that history is not only written by those born into privilege, but also by those who rise, fall, endure, and return, still carrying the memory of where they started and the responsibility of what they changed.